But now with this directive and other regulations, really some different thinking is in order. And that segmentation, there are some pretty specific things that need to happen. But I would like to really note that the challenge is on the network side. Understanding where the IT network stops and where the OT network begins it's not challenging when you look at it on a piece of paper. But when you're implementing security and trying to control application data flows and ensure operations and make sure that you have all the operational capabilities and security capabilities that you need, that line gets pretty fuzzy pretty quick. So we really have to start thinking along the lines of network interconnections, security perimeters and boundaries, demilitarized zones or DMZs, and then an additional layer of DMZs that I call the active defense zone or an ADZ. How all of those things work together to allow us to do things with our OT systems, like how do you patch an OT system that can't have internet access? How do you provide antivirus updates into an OT system that can't have internet access? How do you do multi-factor authentication on an OT system that doesn't have internet access? Those are all things that we need to think about when we're building and architecting these systems so that we can create defensible networks and defensible architectures as we move in time. And this is going to be the perfect opportunity for the pipeline operators to really set that mindset for themselves and think differently about the way they're implementing the networks.
I still think that when we talk about micro-segmentation, it's become the new buzzword, I know. Everyone still thinks about network segmentation in more of a physical sense, in that I'm going to make sure server A is so many feet from server B. I'm going to make sure this cable isn't going between these servers and they're not connected in this way. However, we've been focusing on the importance of identifying what your most sensitive data is, what's the threat, what application hosts that data. So application data flows, when you talk about segmenting that traffic, and I know use case 5 would be a good example of how granular there are certain segmentation data flows, there's still the concept people think of that physical network segmentation instead of logical isolation of data flows. I know Certes has a play on that. We don't need to get into that this morning, but just interested in your thoughts on where the view is on segmentation and the importance, again, to almost like you said, the different types of encryption for different things, the different types of segmentation and why they're important.
Right. Yeah. And that those conversations go hand in hand. So with segmentation, there's clearly physical segmentation, network segmentation, and then there's data segmentation, like you're talking about with micro-segmentation and those tools. And I think the use case that we discussed yesterday at the CISA event is a perfect example whereby you've implemented this best practice approach to Active Directory. So you've got read-only Active Directory and protected Active Directory, which is the writable Active Directory. And to even go a step further in that use case, we're protecting those data flows between the writable domain controllers and the read-only domain controllers with data encryption. So those application data flows between the writable domain controllers and the read-only domain controllers, we're protecting that data with a Certes enforcement point. And clearly, those domain controllers have to be patched, right? So there's a patch management system that's going to patch those domain controllers, but we're going to choose not to encrypt that data, right? And so this is an example of how data protection really fits into that segmentation conversation. It's not just about physical. It's not just about network and communications. It's also about segmenting and treating the treatments for your data that you deem critical. We're deeming the conversation between the writable domain controllers and the read-only domain controllers as critical, and we're encrypting that traffic, treating it like it's critical. And so I think that's a perfect example of what you're pointing out there, and how there are multiple levels, whether you're talking about monitoring threats, whether you're talking about segmentation, whether you're talking about cryptography and encryption. all of these capabilities are being leveraged at multiple layers in different ways, and that's one of the things I said yesterday is we get told all the time to reduce complexity.
Yeah.
But that's just really not our reality. We have to embrace complexity. It's complex, and you have to think about it in a multidimensional way at different levels, and you have to apply your capabilities in a multidimensional way at different levels.
Points you raised was security you can take these directives, but they can't compromise your operating environment, your day-to-day basis. So layer 2, layer 3 typical encryption, doesn't it blind packet headers, blind network traffic flows? Right. How are you going to operate?
And I think that's the issue that you have to really think about is are you enacting conflicting controls in that, okay, I'm going to encrypt everything using link encryption like MACsec or IPsec, but then later in the directive it says, and by the way, you'll be doing continuous monitoring. Right. So how do you continuously monitor encrypted payloads or packets that are totally encrypted, including the communications headers and all of that? I think the answer is you don't. So you have to be really careful when you're imagining how to move forward on this journey of trying to be secure, and this is my stance. You have to be secure first. You have to be compliant second. So if you'll do the work to be secure and ensure that you have those capabilities first, then you assess what you've done for the gap for compliance, and then you address those gaps with your individual controls. So you build your capabilities, right, and become secure. Then you assess the gaps between your security and their compliance, and you address those gaps individually.
If you wouldn't mind a couple of minutes on where would Certes come in then in terms of falling in as a capability rather than a product,
right? Well, and I think I've had many conversations with technical people and even my team about the difference between link encryption and data protection, right? Yeah. There's a difference. Yeah. Link encryption is most typically employed when you don't trust the communications path, and you just need to wrap it. You need to wrap your data with security. Yeah. You don't need to secure your data because when it gets to the other side, it's you again, and you don't need to secure that data. You just need to secure the transmission of the data. That's link encryption or network encryption, however you want to think about that. But when you have specific data that is critical to your operations or sensitive to your operations, or data that you don't want exfiltrated, you have to actually protect the data. Yes. And that's a different thing. So when they say encryption at rest, in transit, and in use, right? That's where you're starting to talk about different components of data protection. The in-transit part of that, just 1/3 of that, is about network encryption, IPsec, MACsec. Another third of that is about encryption at rest. So that's how do you encrypt that data whenever it's on your servers, when it's on your laptop. But then there's the in-use part, which is how do you encrypt it in memory, and how do you encrypt it when it's moving between systems that are even local to each other, or not necessarily local, but adjacent to each other, not flowing across security boundaries per se. And so I think it's important for critical infrastructure people to get their mind around cryptography, how it's used to defend, how it's used offensively against us, because cryptography has been weaponized. Yeah. And then once you understand those junctures, then I ask the question, because this is who I am, unfortunately, sometimes. I ask the question, now how do I weaponize cryptography against my adversaries, right? And so that goes to really taking an approach where you're developing counter tactics. You're looking at their tactics, you're developing counter tactics. And that's the thing I like to do. If anything could be considered fun in security, to me, that's the fun part. I like to develop counter tactics. And so I think it's worth thinking about. It's worth talking about inside of the critical infrastructure space. And, I shared this concern with you. I said, Simon, I may say these things and everybody in the audience might go, well, yeah, of course. That's given. We all know that. Or they could, have a light bulb moment where they're like, oh, I didn't think of it that way. It's the kind of thinking that's in order to be secure as critical infrastructure operators.
Well, I think the yeah, absolutely, the different way of thinking is certainly needed, because the adversaries all of the time are finding different ways of thinking and creating. There still seems to be, we still seem to have mindsets in a traditional network security, and one example from what you've just said is you've got data in transit, say going through an IPsec tunnel. The encryption's protecting the comms link, not necessarily the data, and people don't necessarily see the two. They assume the data's safe, but there's been numerous cases where a configuration error in that third-party network provider, there's a vulnerability, an orchestration error, something's wrong, and all of a sudden that communications link is no longer secure, meaning all of the data inside it isn't secure either, because the protection isn't on the data, it's on that network infrastructure, that comms link.
Right.
There still seems to be, though, that mindset that my network is secure, so the data flowing across it is secure. Are we seeing that start to change now as people wake up to these breaches happening?
Yeah, I think it has to change, and it's not a new reality. Man in the middle and the ability to intercept traffic, that's always been a, you can go back to undergraduate school, and if you're taking cybersecurity classes, they're teaching you about man in the middle and how data becomes intercepted and modified. It falls into the confidentiality, integrity, availability, CIA triad right in there. So I don't think it's a new topic, but I think you're right that so many times vendors have sold you the we've got a VPN, we've got an IPsec product, so IPsec is the de facto security standard. When you're a hammer, everything is a nail, so to speak. So I just think it's really important for CI operators to get their mind right about the differences between communications encryption, data encryption. What are you protecting? Think about that. What is the subject of your protections? Is it the data or is it the link? And then act accordingly. I'm not saying there's not a place for IPsec. I'm not saying there's not a place for MACsec, right? Our operations, we use IPsec. Our operations, we use MACsec. We use data protections. We use every tool in the belt. And if you want to be successful against your adversaries, that's what you're going to have to do. You have to use every tool.
Now, you focus very much on the security side of things, but equally as important to you is the operational side of things.
Sure.
So one of the, back to the directive, the requirement of encrypting any OT traffic over an IT system. Now, a typical pipeline operator of gas, the larger ones, you're looking around 2,000 plus nodes. So if you're looking at traditional solutions to this approach, let's say you're in charge of that environment and you've been given a directive, what would it mean to apply IPsec tunnels to protect over 2,000 nodes?
So for me personally, my experience with IPsec tunnels says that there's not enough coffee in the entire universe for me to do that. I know there are very large teams with very large environments that probably manage those kinds of numbers of IPsec tunnels. But my 20-plus year experience in IT tells me that is very heavy administrative overhead associated with that.
Well, remember, they're not doing this today. This is now, they're doing a certain manageable amount, but now if this requirement comes in, all of those low bandwidth
all at once.
It's everything. It's every link.
And I would say as a CI operator, we had that option early in our SCADA field networks, and we chose not to do it because of the relatively low speed links that we used to communicate and pull telemetry over could not support the link encryption. It just wasn't there. So, I think based on what I know about IPsec tunnel administration, I mean, clearly, I've done that myself. I was a senior network engineer at Western Farmers, and we had IPsec tunnels. We had a lot of them. But there's nothing that, it seems like there's nothing that the network team hates more than having to coordinate IPsec tunnels across companies and business partners and operational divisions. And they every time you bring it up, they're like, oh my gosh, not another one.
But again, everything has a purpose. There's different tools are needed for different outcomes, right? There's a need for those, but it's not the right tool to secure data in
Absolutely not.
sensitive data, and certainly in a large volume.
Right.